which those creatures crawled around. They knew that B-17s, flying fortresses, were rolling off the Boeing assembly lines and being sent there prepared to incinerate the ant heaps, and that they were even being sent from the European theater. And at that point, they attacked the two military bases from which the attack was to be launched. That's what we call the date which will live in infamy. They tried to offer that defense, but it was not considered acceptable. They were hanged. Those are pretty clear cases of preemptive war. Now, the Iraq War does not rise to that level. There's no serious sense in which it's a preemptive war. So essentially, this defense is irrelevant. The Japanese and the Nazis, of course, professed the most noble ideals. In fact, it's hard to find a case of aggression and atrocities in history which are not defended that way. That was not considered a defense and shouldn't have been. Well, that's the standard. It's not that the Nuremberg standard is so noble. In fact, it was deeply flawed morally in ways we ought to be concerned about. The Nuremberg trials were based on the moral principle that a war crime is a crime that you committed and we didn't. So, for example, a heavy bombing of urban concentrations was not considered a war crime because the Allies did more of it than the Germans. German war criminals were able to defend themselves successfully if they could show that their American or British counterparts had committed the same crimes. So it's by no means a noble standard, but it's nevertheless a serious standard. At a minimum, a standard we should stand up for. The person who presided over the Nuremberg tribunals, U.S. Justice Robert Jackson, addressed the tribunal in an important address, and he said, we are handing these defendants a poisoned chalice, and if we ever sip from it, if we ever do something similar, we must be subject to the same judgments. Otherwise, this trial is a complete farce. Well, that poses the question of accountability. Do we say that the trial was a complete farce, or do we accept even that limited standard? There's no question of the applicability of the charges. So it seems to me that essentially finishes the question of accountability on the core issue. The question remains, we have to make a decision. But what about the question of university policy? Well, there is a principle which I think is defensible. In fact, I pretty much accept it, and always have, that the university should not consider the extracurricular activities of its stakeholders, students, faculty, staff, anyone's there. They should ask if they're fulfilling their university responsibilities. I think that's a reasonable, defensible principle. Only, however, if it's taken seriously. So, for example, suppose that, say, a mathematician at Stanford decides to take off a couple of years and rob and burn banks, or to go off to South Waziristan and advise Al-Qaeda on how to carry out nuclear terror in New York. Well, by this principle, Stanford shouldn't care. When he comes back, he's admitted. If that condition is satisfied, then we can take the principle seriously. Suppose, however, that this person is, let's say, a political economist, and he comes back after these activities to teach courses on how to rob and burn banks, with good reason. He suggests that's the way to deal with the plunder of this terrible financial crisis. Just rob them and burn them down, and teaches courses on how to do it. Or suppose he comes back and offers instruction on how to construct small nuclear weapons and sneak them into the United States and put them in New York and blow the place up on the not implausible grounds that that's the way to stop imperial aggression all over the world. Nothing else is going to work. Well, at that point, I think the university does have a decision. Is that meeting university responsibilities? You can make your own. And if it doesn't accept it, then it shouldn't accept it in even worse cases, like launching aggressive war, the ultimate crime. Well, I don't presume to offer you answers to these questions. I think you should think them through, but I do think they're the kinds of questions that should be considered, should be uppermost in your mind when you consider the questions of accountability and university policy.